Could I just reiterate the purpose of this event? It's a charity event to raise funds for the charity run by IHRA in Hebron. Hebron is one of the most heavily affected areas of the West Bank by settler violence towards the indigenous Palestinians. And this violence often goes undocumented and people don't know the level. So IHRA decided to start a charity for the young people to become involved, and it's called Youth Against Settlements. And his idea was that in order to document these incidents, he would provide the youth in Hebron with video equipment. And that video equipment could be used to monitor and hopefully curtail the violence of some of the settlers, and then put that information, the video information, on social network. And obviously to do that, it's quite an expensive task to provide the video equipment to the youth. So what we want to do here is raise as much money as we can in order to help IHRA with his charity. Thanks very much. Now, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. It's Azzam Tamimi. Are you any relation to the Tamimis, the Arhead Tamimi and Bassam? Are you?
Originally, they're all from Hebron.
Ah, right. So Tamimi is a family Hebron family name. That's excellent. We've had dinner with Bassam Tamimi in his house. So if you'd like to come up, Azzam, and tell us a little bit about your experiences and your background, and tie it in with, hopefully, with some of the things you saw on the film, because you've probably got more experience here than any of us, and anything else you could add to the film would be very welcome. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm really grateful for the invitation. It must be very courageous to organize something like this at this time when the Zionist lobby in this country and around the world seems to be angered by any effort to remind the world of exactly what happened to Palestine and the Palestinians. My usual approach is to talk about the roots of the conflict, but I think the film has beautifully demonstrated how this conflict started, at least in Palestine. So I think what I would like to address in the minutes available to me is how this conflict is likely to come to an end. But before I do this, I was born in Hebron. I was born in 1955, and a couple of years ago I started writing my autobiography, and I begin my autobiography by saying that although I was born in 1955, my story really begins in 1948, because my mother, who was displaced from her own hometown, Beersheba, where she was born and where she grew up, met my father when she was driven out of Beersheba together with their family upon arriving in Hebron, where they got married, and then I left Palestine at the age of about 8 in 1963, grew up in Kuwait, and after finishing my high school in Kuwait, I came to this country to do my A-levels and then on to do the rest of my education all the way up to the PhD. Now, is this conflict unique? Not really. I mean, the world has seen so many conflicts that are almost identical. The French occupied Algeria for nearly 130 years. And the French, for much of the time, really nearly claimed exactly the same thing that the Zionists claim today, that Algeria was theirs, they were superior, They had every God-given right to come and annex the entire Algerian territory and turn it into a countryside of France. The Italians did the same in Libya, in other places as well. This country, when it was an empire, the United Kingdom or Britain, the British Empire, occupied so many parts of the world, in Asia, in Africa, and elsewhere. And colonialism was always justified in exactly the same term. The same terms were used to justify colonialism. Michael Pryor wrote a book about this, entitled The Bible and Colonialism. It's a wonderful book that explains how all projects of colonialism were actually justified in exactly the same way. Now, how did all these projects end? They came to an end. South Africa, apartheid in South Africa, generation after generation, probably South Africans thought they'd never be free. Eventually they became free. So every single colonial enterprise comes to an end because it's against nature. It's against human nature. It's against God, which claims to be speaking in His divine name. They claim that God gave them the right to dispossess others, to take their land, to do to them whatever they wanted, whatever they like to do. This is what the conquista of the Americas also did to the indigenous populations of the Americas. What the white man of Europe did also to the indigenous populations of Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere. But it seems to me that the Zionists in Palestine are not willing to learn any lesson from the history of colonialism around the world. And the really sad thing is that the democratic world, including the country in which we live, but also the United States of America, which always prided itself with liberal democracy, accept the justifications of Zionism, which are against human rights, against human nature, and against God. I mean, where else in the world today do you find a community that claims that God gave them the right to come and invade somebody else's country, occupy it, drive them out, turn them into slaves, persecute them, kill them, do to them whatever they wished? Why can a Jew allegedly claim to be the chosen people of God, and therefore God gave them a land, while a Christian, we do not accept this from a Christian, not anymore. Probably in the past it was accepted, or some people claimed it in the name of Christianity. We cannot accept it from a Muslim, even though some Muslims did it. ISIS, actually ISIS is the other face of Zionism, because some of the claims of ISIS are no different from the claims of Netanyahu and his clique, claiming that God gave them the right to enslave others just because they happen to be different. We don't accept this from a Muslim. We don't accept it from a Hindu, although today Modi in India actually uses the exact Zionist rhetoric in order to suppress and persecute the people of Kashmir. But we don't accept it. We don't accept it from anybody because it's not acceptable. It's simply not acceptable. But the democratic world accepts it from the Zionists. And the Zionists have power, have leverage within political parties, as you all experience, within governments, within the media, and they try to use their leverage in order to get people to silence others who dare speak, who dare criticize, and who dare raise questions about all of this. Now, initially, the Zionist project in Palestine seemed based on victimhood, that because of what happened to the Jews in Europe, it was justifiable for them to come and occupy Palestine and establish a homeland which was supposed to be the safest on the face of the earth for the Jews. But then, as time went by, as the settler movement grew more ferocious, especially after the peace process started, and this is one of the ironies of the peace process, that a lot more settlements were built after the Arabs entered into peace with Israel, as if the Zionists were actually using peace right from day number one, only to expand and to entrench themselves in Palestine. We've come a long way until today. We find that the majority of the political elite in Israel actually belong to the so-called right wing, a very extremist brand of Zionism that is so openly racist. Probably the founders of Zionism or the founding fathers of Zionism were not as daring in expressing their fascism, but today you listen to Netanyahu and listen to the rest of the people in the Zionist establishment in Israel. They don't want to see the Arabs around. They want a purely Jewish state in Palestine. They're thinking about ways of simply depopulating the land. Today we're hearing and reading arguments about what's likely to happen to the Palestinians of the 1948, as they are called, who happen to be Israeli citizens of Palestinian origin, because they remained within what became Israel in 1948, but now they don't want them anymore. They accuse them of being traitors, of thinking like other Palestinians, of sympathizing with the other Palestinians, etc. The sort of fascism inherent in Zionism is today appearing for everybody to see, and see very clearly. And you think this project will last long? Impossible. It cannot last long. Such projects can only last if the victims are completely annihilated. The Palestinians are still there, and no matter how many of them they kill, how much they persecute them. You go and speak to my family in Hebron, speak to the rest of the Palestinians anywhere within Palestine or even in the diaspora. Those within Palestine will tell you, we are here, we are not going anywhere. Those who are in the diaspora will tell you, we are not in a hurry, we'll continue the struggle, and we'll wait until we go back. So we are going to return one day. So really, Israel in its present shape has no hope. And we're not talking here about the Jews. We're not talking here about whether the Jews can live or not live in Palestine. We Palestinians have no problem with the Jews. We actually never had a problem with the Jews until the advent of Zionism. The Zionists were the ones who introduced themselves as Jews. They claimed to represent the Jewish people. And frankly, I must tell you, only when I came to this country at the age of 18 or 19 that I started learning that there were Jews who disagreed with Zionism. And there were Jews who loathed the Zionists for claiming to speak on their behalf. So now we know that initially most of the Jews were anti-Zionist. Today they are a minority, but they are still struggling, and they are steadfast in opposing Zionism. So our conflict is not with the Jews as followers of the religion of Judaism. And we know that the strict followers of Judaism, many of them are anti-Zionists, like our friends in Naturi Karta, for instance, and similar groups. This is about a purely political colonial enterprise that is similar to the colonization of South Africa that produced apartheid, similar to the colonization of France in Algeria, by France in Algeria, the colonization of every other imperialist power of the weaker nations of the world. Eventually, it will come to an end. And that's why our message to those who support Israel or support Zionism, that look to the future. In the future, there will not be Zionism. Zionism will come to an end. It's inevitable. It will come to an end. Because it's anti-human, it's anti-nature. Let's think about a future in which we can live in peace together as equal human beings, with equal human rights. This is our challenge to those who support the racist entity that is called Israel. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Azzam. Could I just follow on slightly from that theme? We've got the Labour Party conference here in Brighton this week, and one of the most endangered groups in the Labour Party are Jews who support Palestine. And many Jews in the Labour Party who've been suspended or expelled for their support of Palestine. And I think we owe them a tribute. We know, of course, that not all Zionists are Jews. A lot of Zionists, as Azzam said, are Christians. But there seems to be a certain, let's say, focus on anybody, doesn't matter whether it's a Christian or a Jew, who supports Palestine. And that's not just in the Labour Party, that tends to be widespread. But in the Labour Party, the Jews seem to be taking the biggest burden. And what we often say in these meetings is, these meetings, although some might try to portray them as such, they're not anti-Semitic in any way at all. We're not accusing all Jews of anything. We're not accusing any particular Jews of anything. What we're trying to do is focus the attention on the damage that Zionism is doing to the Jewish religion, as much as it's, well, maybe not quite as much as it's doing to the Palestinians, but it's certainly getting Jews into trouble because there are idiots who try and conflate the activities of the Zionists with all Jews, and because of that, they attack Jews. And we've got friends as Azzam said, in the Tory Carter, who are Jews who don't support Zionism, and they've had attacks on them personally and to their property. Now, I'd like to introduce Tom Suares, a writer, State of Terror. He's got some books of his own here, which we can sell for the charity that we're supporting at the end. And let's raise as much money as we can to support the Hebron charity. Tom, would you like to have a word?
Thank you everyone. Put this on. I'd like to follow up on Carl Sabah's film about why, ultimately, we are here today. Why are young people in Hebron struggling against their ethnic subjugation, and why is it all so relevant to the Labour Party? As the film showed us, 102 years ago, in the midst of the Great War, propagandists for the then relatively recent racial nationalist ideology of Zionism approached the British and played on classic anti-Jewish stereotypes to which they were confident the British would be receptive. The Zionists pretended that the Jews exert great worldwide influence and could help rally the United States on Britain's behalf in the war. And all the Zionists would need in return was, well, how about Palestine? Now, for the British, this was a triple win. Not only did they believe the trope about the power of the Jews to influence world events, in this case the outcome of the war, but secondly, in the bargain, they got a huge Jewish ghetto far away to keep Jews from coming to Britain. And thirdly, they believed that the Zionists could serve as surrogates to expand the British Empire to Palestine. And so, over the impassioned objections of principled people like Edwin Montagu, who bluntly and correctly accused his government of anti-Semitism for acquiescing to the Zionists, the British became the midwife for their racial nationalist project. And lest there be any doubt, it is explicit in British records that the British knew all along, that the Zionist project was not about some vague, lofty spiritual home, but it was to seize all of Palestine at a minimum and to ethnically cleanse it of non-Jews. All the protestations to the contrary, whether that implicit in the Balfour Declaration itself, or the statements of people like Chaim Weizmann or David Ben-Gurion, or, let us not forget, as the film showed, Winston Churchill, these were all blatant lies. What is going on today, at this moment in Palestine, was always the plan, and the British, in 1917, knew it. But I wonder what they would have thought if they could have known that as a result of their actions, a century later, we would be here today fighting against Zionist corruption of British democracy, of British free speech, and of British academic integrity. 2 decades after the war to end all wars, the world is again at war, the Allies struggling against the most terrible racial nationalist movement the world has ever known. And in 1945, racial nationalism is defeated, averting an unthinkably dark future for humankind. Well, racial nationalism is defeated with one exception. Zionism managed not only to escape accountability, but counterintuitively to use the horrors of the war to further its own brand, however different, its own brand of racial, ethnic, imperialist nationalism. And in 1947, the UN, caving to U.S. political pressure, again as we saw in the film, and years of relentless Zionist terrorism, denies Palestinian self-determination and sets the stage for the creation of the Israeli state, a state that the UN in 1947 already knew perfectly well would never abide by its agreed borders. Today, 7 decades later, the tragedy we face is what happens when a violent, racist ideology is not merely tolerated, but actively empowered by the world's powerful nations. Now, there are several reasons why we of the allegedly enlightened West empower Israel, but the one that concerns us here today during the Labor Conference is Israel's wielding of the smear of anti-Semitism, all furthered by a mass media that finds it less troublesome to go along with the lies rather than fulfill their obligation to society. Israel's anti-Semitic pretense of being interchangeable with Jews as a people and its exploitation of anti-Semitism to silence opponents is its not-so-secret weapon. By holding Jewish identity hostage as a human shield, Israel makes condemnation of the state, condemnation of Jews as Jews, thus making criticism of Zionism and Israel by this grotesque construct anti-Semitic by definition. Israel constantly waves over our heads the phrase, the Jewish state, like some talisman to frighten us. Not a Jewish state in the sense of a national faith that any nation might adopt, irrelevant to ethnicity and stopping at the borders, but the Jewish state. Yet at the same time, Israel would have us believe that its claim to be the Jewish state is no different than, say, Liechtenstein as a Catholic state, or Algeria as a Muslim state, or India as a Hindu state, or Burma as a Buddhist state. But this is sleight of hand. Israel's claim is altogether different and is unique in the world. Israel claims to be Jews by blood transnationally. Let's take my last example, Burma as a Buddhist state. What if Burma were to exploit Buddhists exactly as Israel exploits Jews? Now, like Israel, Burma is engaged in ethnic cleansing, for which it has been universally condemned. But what if the Burmese propagandists were to announce that, look, we are not a Buddhist state, we are the Buddhist state. We are the manifestation of the Buddhist people. A nationality based not on citizenship in the political sense, but on blood descent worldwide. We are the self-determination of this construct we have invented called the Buddhist people. And then Burma's propagandists announced a new definition of anti-Buddhist bigotry, the Buddhist equivalent of IHRA, which, in summary, codifies that any claim made against the Burmese state, for example, to accuse Burma of racism for its ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya, is instead a libel against Buddhists, all Buddhists, simply because they are Buddhists. And the Burmese propagandists come to Britain and smear anyone or any organization as bigots if they do not accept and enforce their new definition of anti-Buddhist bigotry. And when principled people still challenge Burma for its crimes, the Burmese inquisitors scream racism, and all the media, all the way from the BBC and The Guardian down to the Daily Mail, ignorantly feast on the scandal. The anti-racists are expelled from their parties, organizations, or jobs, and every time they try to speak, they are blocked by the Burmese propagandists. Now, when I describe this, it is so preposterous as to be comical, yet it is precisely what we have allowed Israel to do. And just as Burma would implicitly be transferring culpability for its crimes onto Buddhists in order to carry this out, as this alleged race, in order to inoculate itself, Israel is directly claiming that it is Jews, not individuals that happen to be Jewish, as they might happen to be vegetarian or have brown eyes, but Jews as a people who are the doers of its crimes. Israel cannot have it both ways. In other words, traditional anti-Semitism can only attack externally. Despite all its murders, all its horrors, all its desecration, traditional anti-Semitism is powerless to lessen the integrity of Jews or Judaism. Zionism, if we accept it, does. If we accept it, as Labor regretfully has done, then we have libeled Jewry itself. All our lives, we are endlessly accustomed to politicians and political parties feigning innocence when they are guilty. We now live in the extraordinary situation where this is reversed, in which the Labour Party and its leader are confessing to crimes of which they are innocent, like something out of the purges of Stalinism or Pol Pot's Cambodia. Confessing to a crime you didn't commit for fear of what might happen if you don't confess. Tragically, Corbyn foolishly believed that if he confessed, the inquisitors might leave him alone. Corbyn's attempt at appeasement began just after he won Labour leadership in 2015, but this was always going to be futile because Corbyn's long history is one of dedicated anti-racism and thus implicitly anti-Zionist. And so already the following month, the Daily Mail, quoting unnamed experts, reported that anti-Semitism was suddenly so bad that, I quote the Daily Mail, Jews feel as threatened as they did in the Holocaust. Imagine that. A grotesque belittling of what Hitler's victims endured. In April 2016, then, the National Review ran a piece entitled, quote, Why the Left Hates Jews, and jumped right to Corbyn and the UK Labour Party in the first sentence. The following month, the Daily Mail said the rate of, quote, hate crimes against Jews soars. As report says, anti-Semitism is at the core of far-left beliefs. We are to think Labour Party. By January 2017, the Telegraph reports that anti-Semitism had increased again, specifically because of Corbyn and the Labour Party. It continued to get even worse. In July, the BBC and The Independent both report, quote, anti-Semitic attacks hit record high again in the UK. And again in February of 2018, anti-Semitism, yes, has soared yet higher, with Labour said to be in, quote, total disarray for its failure to confront what one would surmise are the hordes of seething anti-Semites comprising its membership. None of these media betrayed any sense of wonder at the charade, nor any curiosity as to the methodology, data, and motives of the sources, typically the Community Service Trust, the Board of Deputies, and the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, all of which are Zionist propaganda fronts. And when the BBC ran a report headlined, quote, over a quarter of British people hold anti-Semitic attitudes, it did not even question why the survey, if you actually read the fine print, matched attitudes towards Jews with attitudes towards Israel. Zionism thrives on anti-Jewish bigotry and fears nothing more than a world in which all Jews live in safety and equality worldwide. Organizations claiming to represent the Jewish community make an industry out of maintaining anti-Semitism hysteria, creating what I would call legitimately a mass psychosis, while aligning themselves with the true anti-Semitism of emerging neo-fascist but invariably pro-Zionist regimes, especially in Eastern Europe, in Brazil, in the United States, and the Philippines. Anti-Semitism, real or imagined, is Zionism's oxygen. Whether or not one likes Jeremy Corbyn's politics, we should all be outraged that Israel's propagandists could influence who leads Britain, arguably robbing Britain of an honest, progressive prime minister who had been the hope of millions. I have never met or had any contact with Mr. Corbyn or his staff, and I have never had any official position in Britain. Yet even I was used in an attempt to smear him. When I, a permanent tax-paying British resident, was invited to discuss British source documents held by the British government about the British mandate in the British city of Portsmouth, Britain's supposed anti-radicalization program, PREVENT, closed us down, not just one venue after another, but throughout the entire city on behalf of the Israeli state. After which the Daily Mail linked me to Mr. Corbyn, our mugshot side by side, with the usual lies in the headline about what I allegedly would have said at the thwarted talk. And by the way, despite the considerable efforts of Portsmouth and South Downs PSC, PREVENT has to this day refused to clear my name. Now, I'd like to take a brief look at the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, so-called definition of anti-Semitism that Labor has endorsed. According to IHRA, anti-Semitism includes, quote, accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interests of their own nations. Now, right off, this is a very strange clause because it altogether omits the sole point, the only point upon which the entire definition depends. Are the Jewish citizens being accused because they are Jewish or because of their actions without regard to their ethnicity? Now, if we give the IHRA the benefit of a doubt and assume that despite how long it is and how verbose it is, its authors simply overlook the only point that matters and assume that Jews are being accused by virtue of being Jews, then yes, of course, this is true anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, in the very next example, we find out that Zionism is itself guilty. Quote, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. So, Israel is the self-determination of this construct called the Jewish people. Jews, simply because they are Jews, are intrinsically bound to this nation state. If that's the case, then Zionism is the theft of individual Jewish self-determination. Worse, if in fact Israel is a racist endeavor, which it blatantly is and always has been, then according to this definition endorsed by Labor, racism is the self-determination of Jews as Jews. Hard to imagine anything more anti-Semitic than that. Yet for Zionism, it gets worse, because according to the first clause, accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal, etc., Zionism is anti-Semitic, but according to this one, it's anti-Semitic to point it out. The juxtaposition of these two clauses is extraordinary. IHRA is engineered to make it anti-Semitic to end Zionist anti-Semitism. By the next example, there is no longer even the pretense that Jews are the topic. The topic is Israel. Quote, using the symbols and images associated with the classic anti-Semitism to characterize Israel or Israelis. And in the next example as well, one is left wondering how Jews have vanished as the IHRA's professed concern. Quote, drawing comparison of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. So, if it is against Jews to make such an analogy about the Israeli state, no matter how valid an analogy might or might not be regarding that state, it is, according to IHRA, the Jews that are committing the acts, not the Israeli state per se. Again, it is IHRA, not anyone making such analogies about Israel, that implicitly claims this. Comparing the contemporary policy, as the definition had it, of some nation state, Israel or otherwise, to a political movement or ideology, Nazism or otherwise, can be anti-Semitic only if the IHRA authors are committing the anti-Semitism of this final IHRA example. Quote, holding Jews collectively responsible for the actions of the state of Israel. Yes, thank you. Holding Jews, or any other ethnicity, let's say Buddhists, collectively responsible for the actions of the state of Israel, or any other state, say Burma, is indeed true racism. It's bigotry, prejudice, ignorance. Yet this is Zionism's very core. If we accept Zionism, the actions of Jews as a people and the Israeli state are synonymous. This would be racist on its very principle, even if Israel were the nicest state in the galaxy. But, of course, in the ultimate Orwellian conundrum, Israel has inoculated itself against this as well. I will finish by quoting this extraordinary, circular reasoning from the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism that inoculates Zionism not just from us, but from itself. Quote, accusing Jews, now bearing in mind that Jews are whom the CIA is accusing, not us, accusing Jews of making accusations of anti-Semitism in order to aid a hidden agenda is, you guessed it, a well-established anti-Semitic slur. So there you have it, no loose ends. Thank you.
Yeah, Tom touched on a good point there. We've in the Labour Party, I'm a member of the Labour Party, and my colleague who helped organise this is also a member of the Labour Party. And we're often criticised when we talk about Palestine and Israel. We're often criticised. They say, well, why do you concentrate on that? Why don't you concentrate on just getting Labour into power? And of course we say, don't you realise that the people who are trying to keep Jeremy Corbyn out of power are the same people who are penalising the Palestinians? It's the Zionists. So we have to be very careful that we're not, and of course we're not, anti-Semitic at all, but we have to point people towards the direction of the problem and try and get them to recognise it, because of course in the Labour Party there are plenty of people who are Zionists, and I don't need to name them, who are not Jewish. But a couple of nights ago, Chris and I were at a Jewish Voice for Labour meeting, and the frustration in that room, it was absolutely packed in a hotel down the road. The frustration in that room was raw, because the Jewish Voice for Labour, they weren't getting the support from the Labour Party. They'd expected that when they expressed the fact that they weren't Zionist and they didn't support Zionist aims, that they would get some support from the Labour Party. And the exact opposite were true. And in fact, in that room, there were Jews who had been expelled from the Labour Party and are still expelled, and they're the people who've been doing the greatest work to help get the Labour Party into power. Their efforts have not been appreciated, and it's a terrible shame. Now, Miko's our next, Miko Peled is our next speaker. Miko Peled, of course, is Jewish. And in this, on this event, we've had Muslims, Miko, Jewish, and of course myself. I'm a bit of a heathen, but it's an event for people across the board. It's not an event for one section of the community to start criticizing another section of the community. What we're trying to do is support democracy. And it's not democratic when an outside influence, if you like, an extraneous influence to Britain is trying to influence our democratic process. And without naming that state, I think we all know the name of that state. And they pour tremendous resources in. If you watch the Al Jazeera documentary, you'll actually see Joan Ryan, who was the representative of Labour Friends of Israel, you'll actually see her talk about accepting £1 million donation in order to further the cause of let's call them the Zionists in Labour Party, to further their cause. And that cause was to prevent Jeremy Corbyn becoming our Prime Minister. And this is an assault on democracy. And that's one of the reasons that we organise these events. Now, Miko, are you ready to speak, or do you want to break for a bit? I don't know whether there's any facilities here, refreshment facilities. I saw somebody with a cup of coffee before, but all right. So would you like a break for a few minutes before before Miko speaks? Hands up if you'd like a break. I'm afraid you're outvoted. Miko, pardon? Democracy. Sorry? Right, okay, that's fine. Yeah. Sorry.
Could I just say to those that aren't aware that the reason why there aren't so many people is because Jeremy Corbyn's doing his leader's speech this afternoon instead of tomorrow, so they can get Parliament back.
All right. Well, one of the reasons it was arranged for this time is because Tom Watson was doing his deputy leader's speech this afternoon. Oh, right. Oh, okay. Well, yeah. Thanks a lot. That explains a few things. I mean, when we arranged it, we thought, well, who wants to listen to Tom Watson? So we arranged it for this afternoon. But, sorry, Miko. Yeah. He's. All right. Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. I get it. So, Miko, you're on next. Thanks, Miko.
There's a little bit of a hum here, a strange hum from the microphones. Could it be that they're facing... Is this better? It's still there? Huh? This one? Is this any better? Yes. Yeah, okay. All right. All right, well, thank you, Jack, for organizing this, and Chris, and for inviting me, and thank you to these two other wonderful panelists. Dr. Azzam and I have spoken several times together, and it's always a pleasure and an honor. And Tom, it's nice to meet you, and that was a great speech. Thank you. That was brilliant. And the books that are here, I encourage everybody. Of course, two of them are mine, but I read Dr. Azzam's book on Hamas, and I relied on it heavily when I wrote Injustice, the second book. It's incredibly interesting. And again, I haven't read your book, Tom, but I look forward to it. So let me tell you a couple of things about what almost happened here. So we were hoping to get one of the Orthodox rabbis to come and speak here as well. Because like you heard, there's a group called Neturei Karta, but there's also a larger group of the Orthodox Jewish community which is completely and thoroughly anti-Zionist. Neturei Karta are the activists within the community, but really, especially here in Britain and in the US, pretty much the entire ultra-Orthodox community is anti-Zionist. And so we were hoping there's a couple here, rabbis here in the UK, they couldn't make it. And last night there was a rabbi from New York, Rabbi Weiss, who is kind of the leading rabbi of Neturei Karta. in New York, and he actually was on a plane last night, and he was going to be here. And for some strange stroke of destiny, the plane had technical difficulties and they canceled the flight. So he was on the plane for 3 hours, and then they canceled the flight, and he called me this morning saying, I'm home, I didn't make it. Huh? Yeah, Rabbi Weiss, yes. And so they're not here, but I think it's, I think their stance on Zionism has been nothing short of heroic for over 100 years, because the ultra-Orthodox community as a whole has been opposed to Zionism, has written about Zionism. The community in Jerusalem has begged the United Nations, when Israel was forced upon them, to give them some kind of a special status. They did not want Israeli citizenship. And to this day, they suffer greatly by the Israeli authorities because of their resistance to Zionism, their resistance to serving in the Zionist army, and so forth. I mean, the pogroms, if you look at the videos of the Israeli police and what they do in the Orthodox neighborhoods, you will think these are pogroms. I mean, it looks nothing short of pogroms. So that's, I think that's an important point to remember, and it would have been good to have him. Now, since this is we declared this to be a benefit event for Youth Against Settlement, or for the Hebron Freedom Fund, which was set up as a charity to support Youth Against Settlement. Issa Amar, who heads it, is a friend of mine. He's a brilliant activist and a brilliant man, practically holding on to one of the most important and beautiful spots, certainly in Hebron, but even in all of Palestine, called Tel Rumeida, practically with his own bare hands from the greedy hands of Israeli settlers. So it's a great thing to do, and I told him about this, and he sent me a message that he asked me to read. So if you'll bear with me, I'll read the message that he sent me this morning. And he says, today Israeli occupation decided to deport Omar Shakir, Human Rights Watch director in Palestine. I was in the military court last Sunday, where I am facing 16 military charges for protesting without violence in exercising free speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom to protest. We as Palestinians are subject to military law rather than civilian law. I am a Palestinian living in Hebron. I live stateless with no rights. I have no rights to general assembly, no rights to free speech, no due process, or freedom of movement. I get 10% of the water settlements living next to me get. I am not allowed to walk down the street of my own city. I can't travel, work, or do business without permission, having been granted at the mercy of the occupation. Living under military law next to illegal Israeli settlers who live under civilian law, I know well the experience of terror and violence. I also know well what apartheid was and what it looks like today in my city. As such, I find it curious that many Labour Party members are under attack by Israel's right-wing government and its supporters. Excuse me. For comparing Israel's policy in my city to apartheid in South Africa, or even criticizing the Israeli occupation. Hebron in particular, and Palestine in general, is divided between those who have rights, namely settlers, and those who don't, Palestinians like me. In 1994, a Brooklyn-born settler named Baruch Goldstein opened fire in Hebron's Ibrahimi Mosque, killing 29 Palestinians in worship. Israel collectively punished us by forbidding us from driving on our main street, Shuhada Street. In addition, what has previously been our vegetable market was sterilized, quote unquote, the military term for free of Palestinians. This was the onset of the process of segregation in my city, turning it into a ghost town as 43% of the residents left. Today, settlers can drive cars on Shuhada Street and carry weapons, but we are barely allowed to enter. When we do, we are compelled to pass through checkpoints stationed at each end of the street. Once inside, we submit our ID cards and the special numbers we have been assigned as residents of our neighborhood, Tel Rumeida. Sometimes it takes hours to get through the checkpoint, only to be denied entry. Surely upon witnessing the segregation, the de facto reality of apartheid was undeniable to many visitors. Since the beginning of Trump administration, things have things even have become even more severe in Hebron. Israel dismissed international observers. Netanyahu announced that he will annex Hebron to Israel, and for sure, annexation of the land without the people. We are used as election objects and without having voting rights, which is a good point because Israel just had elections, general elections, but 5 million people who live under Israeli law did not take part of this. Some 2 million people in Gaza and some 3 million people in the West Bank were not allowed to participate. And of course, what this government ends up doing will affect their life and has been affecting their lives. The checkpoints have increased in number and have been remodeled so that their entrances resemble the front of a maximum security prison. Now what happens to me inside the checkpoint cannot be witnessed by those on the outside. Yet what is perhaps the most brutal form of Israel's apartheid is its two separate sets of legal system. In my city, Hebron, it is a microcosm of the occupation that exists throughout the West Bank. The Israeli government and its apologists will surely continue to attack all freedom and all equality seekers who compare Israel's policies to those of apartheid South Africa. Yet, the only way for Israel to effectively cease such comparisons from being made is for it to end its system of apartheid in Hebron and in Palestine at large. I want to tell you we feel stronger with your support. You are our hope to help us get our full rights. You are our protection. Please don't give up on the Palestinian cause. We need you more than ever. We promise you not to feel tired or to give up till we get our equality, freedom, and justice. Thank you. That's from Azzam. So I've been here the last few days observing mostly what's been going on in the Labour Party conference from the outside. They denied me a pass to go in this year. And so, because they said I behaved in 2017 below standard, but they never defined the standard, so I don't know what I did. And it's been very interesting, especially yesterday when these pro-Palestinian or seemingly pro-Palestinian resolutions were taken. And there's a lot of pro-Palestinian rhetoric and Palestinian flags everywhere, and this was true last year too in Liverpool. There were Palestinian flags everywhere. It seemed like a pro-Palestine rally. Yet on the outside, what we see is members of the party being dismissed, if not kicked out entirely, being suspended. And we're talking about people who have committed no crime, people who are not racist, people who are caring, people as serious as Chris Williamson and so forth. And you wonder, what is happening here? How could it be that on the one hand, you've got all this pro-Palestine rhetoric and these resolutions and talk about recognizing Palestinian state and so forth, and on the other hand, you see the Zionist influence, the Zionist pressure working. I mean, until this morning, until we actually got here, we weren't sure if this event was going to take place because the venue was being threatened. So what is really happening here? Who's winning? Who's doing what? And I have to say, it reminds me a lot of what other European countries have done, which is they recognize the state of Palestine and they make these declarations almost as a way to say, well, look, we're doing something, so leave us alone. But these are things that are safe to do because they have no consequence. Because really the only measure of any consequence is boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So there are countries all over the world, Muslim countries, European countries, that their leaders and their people support Palestine and they speak about Palestine and they don't allow Israelis to enter and so on and so forth. But when you look into it deeper, they're doing business and they have trade with Israel in the billions and billions of dollars. So who cares about the rhetoric? Who cares if you recognize the state of Palestine that doesn't exist or you don't recognize the state of Palestine that doesn't exist? If you're not committed to boycott, to divestment, and to sanctions, it makes no difference. And it's it feels very much like that is what's been going on here. Because the suspension and all this terror and all this pressure that's being held against events like this is worrisome, even with all these other declarations. And since labor is not in government anyway, and by the time they do get into government, who knows what will happen? Will they really have the ability to pass all these resolutions, to actually make all these things, actually as a government, implement all of these resolutions? Meanwhile, the UK is selling weapons to Israel, the very weapons that actually in this conference, Israel has been criticized of using. But who's supplying the weapons? So if you're going to continue to supply the weapons, shut up. But I think the problem is that they don't feel they can shut up because their constituents are demanding something. And I think they found a formula which keeps the constituents happy, but actually doesn't force them to do anything. Because until boycott, divestment, and sanctions are adopted by the Labour Party, by every other party, by every other government, really nothing. There's no reason for Israel to change anything. And as we can see, Israel is not inclined to change anything, except to drop the facade, except to drop this this mask of being peace-loving and caring for peace and wanting to go on with negotiations. I think they felt up to a certain point that they needed to maintain that facade because that was the source of the legitimacy. If Israel denied the rights of Palestinians altogether and made it public, if Israel 30, 40, 50 years ago said what Israeli government ministers and the prime minister are saying today, they would have lost their legitimacy. Today they're at the point where I think they feel strong enough where they don't need that legitimacy, and therefore they can drop the facade. But they're obviously not inclined to do anything whatsoever that is even resembles recognizing the rights of Palestinians. And it's interesting, people still talk about the two-state solution. I mean, every time I hear somebody say, well, such and such an action makes the two-state solution even seem more difficult or more distant. What two-state solution seems distant? There's a two-state solution out there that we can see in the distance? That anybody can see in the distance? What are they talking about? There's only one thing that still remains actually intact from the pre-1967 reality that used to exist in Palestine. And that is the status of the Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. And that's very convenient for Israel. Because there's no West Bank. There is no West Bank. There's Judea and Samaria, and for all practical purposes, they are part of the state of Israel, like the Galilee, like the Negev, like Jerusalem, like any other part. And by the way, in case anybody forgot, there are Palestinians throughout the entire country. But there are about just under 2 million Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship since the state of Israel was established in 1948. And that is really the only thing that remains from that era. So this allows Israel to declare itself a democracy with a Jewish democracy with a small Arab minority. Or they don't even say Arab, they usually say non-Jewish minority. So you have 5 million Palestinians who are not part of any democracy, or not part of the elections, or not part of the state, they're not part of anything. 2 million in a prison, in a concentration camp in the Gaza Strip, and 3 million in Bantustans in what used to be the West Bank and now is Judea and Samaria. And by the way they define these Bantustans in Judea and Samaria is they say, well, we have Judea and Samaria, and it's a thriving area, and we've got wonderful cities and towns and shopping malls and everything. And at the same time, we also have what they call a difficult population that resides there as well. And we all know who they are. But we still have this is really annoying, this microphone thing, isn't it? We still have these 2 million or so Palestinians who are citizens of Israel and participate in voting and so forth. Although their citizenship and my citizenship are absolutely different. We do not share the same citizenship, even though on paper it looks the same. But Israel, this makes it very convenient for Israel, because now Israel can say, well, we have, some 5 million or so, or Israeli Jewish citizens, and just about 2 million Palestinians. Now, they count the Jewish citizens who live everywhere, but they only count the Palestinian citizens who live in pre-1967, because they're the citizens. The other ones, well, they're just a problematic population. They don't belong to us. We have nothing to do with them. And that's really the only remnant, the only thing that still exists from the pre-1967 reality, and Israel is, of course, very happy to keep it that way. Although I think that one of the good things that we've been seeing over the last decade or two is that the term Israeli Arabs has disappeared, all but disappeared, and people appreciate the racism and the horror that is within this term, Israeli Arabs, as though they are the Arabs of Israel. Actually, in Hebrew, it's Arabs of Israel. In other words, they have no distinct characteristics, no distinct claim to the land. They're just Arabs who happen to be here in Israel. So now everybody's called Palestinian, and Palestinian flags are flying in the Nakab. They're flying, and you see them in the Galilee. You see them everywhere, which, of course, is a very good and important development. But the title of this event is BDS, Anti-Semitism, and a Free Palestine. And the anti-Semitism is not really anti-Semitism, like we heard brilliantly here from Tom. It's anti-Zionism is really the issue. And the BDS and anti-Semitism have been talked about pretty much in the same breath by the Zionists. And I'll tell you a story that I found absolutely unbelievable. And I've seen, I've been dealing with this issue for a very long time, so it's hard to surprise me. It came out in about a few months ago that the Israeli Ministry of Education has a special course that high school students have to take. It's an online course before they go on student exchanges overseas. And it's basically a course to educate them a little bit about the situation. This came to light because a Palestinian school, I think from Nazareth, the students were supposed to go on this on a student exchange program, and they had to take the course, and the school said absolutely not, and the parents said absolutely not. So I thought, okay, well, let's check out the course. So I signed up for it. You have to sign up for it. And it's made of little clips, video clips, 10, 15-minute video clips. You have the Minister of Education, you've got an expert on this, you have an expert on strategy, you've got all these, big names, famous people. They speak very casually, very friendly, and they describe the things that our high school kids might confront when they're overseas. Like the ridiculous claim that Israel is an apartheid regime, and it's a democracy, and you see these pictures of, Palestinian members of Knesset, and of course we know that this apartheid thing is nonsense, and then they talk about BDS. There's a whole chapter on BDS. So here's what BDS is. And again, this is by experts. So this is what they're telling. These are these experts, academics, and so forth, bureaucrats who know. And they're explaining to the students that BDS is what we call a green and red alliance. Red being extreme radical communists, and the green being extreme radical Islamists, jihadists. And they created an alliance in order to destroy Israel. And that's how BDS was born. It has nothing to do with justice, it has nothing to do with fairness, it has nothing to do with the occupation. It's just this anti-Semitic alliance between these two extreme groups. And that's how we need to explain it. And if we explain it like that, people understand that really there's nothing to this whole BDS business. This is how they view BDS. This is how they talk about BDS. At the same time, they've got the Ministry of Strategic Affairs that has a war chest, unlimited funds to fight this BDS. In America, you've got all these lunatic Zionist politicians, Chuck Schumer, who was a senator from New York, and others, who are explaining to everybody how BDS is a new type of anti-Semitism. It's kind of a sneaky type of anti-Semitism because it's not so apparent. It seems as though it's fighting for a just cause. It's this kind of type of a just struggle. But really, it's anti-Semitic. What all of these people fail to do, by design I'm sure, is take a look and explain what the demands of BDS are and where it came from. Is when they make these claims like, well, why are you picking on Israel? Well, my reply is, why not pick on Israel? I can pick on anybody I want to pick on, right? So why not pick on Israel? But fine, I don't want to pick on China, I want to pick on Israel. But that's besides the point. The thing is, the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions came from, not from communists and Islamists, it came from the Palestinian people, from Palestinian civil society. In other words, the people who are suffering the reality in Palestine, the Palestinians, came to us with this request, with this demand, with this roadmap, if you will, which I think is a gift, telling us what we can do in order to support Palestine or justice in Palestine. It goes beyond solidarity. It's action. It's participating in the resistance. It's a gift to especially all of us who live out on the outside. It's telling us what we are expected to do by the people, the very people who are suffering the consequences of the state of Israel. And what are these demands? What are these horrible, dangerous anti-Semitic demands? Justice, freedom, and equality. So the demand is to end the military occupation, where the military occupation still exists. Equal rights, so that the citizenship that I have and the rights that I have, the privileges that I have when I'm in Palestine, will be afforded to Palestinians as well. And the right of return, so the Palestinians have a right to return to their lands and their home. Anybody want to point out the anti-Semitism? Can somebody point out the anti-Semitism? It doesn't even mention Jews. Never mind, it doesn't even mention Jews. These are not demands to kick somebody out, to throw people, to deport them, to send them away, to kill them. No, it's just to remedy the three realities under which Palestinians exist as a result of the creation of the State of Israel, the result of Zionism. The exile, the forced exile, so return of the refugees, the military occupation, which is still there, and the apartheid regime, the lack of equality between Israelis and Palestinians. Now, if Palestinians had the same rights as I do when I am in Palestine, that wouldn't hurt me. Quite the opposite, it'll probably make life better for everyone. But it's not about taking anything away from the Jews, from the Israeli Jews. And the way I differentiate, and I think is maybe a little more accurate than the way, there's Israelis and there are Palestinians. Israelis are these new creation, they're like the whites in South Africa. They are this new people that was created by Zionism in Palestine. So that's where I come from. These are Israelis. It has nothing to do with Jews. It has nothing to do with the Jews out there. These are Israelis, and they're the problem. That's the issue. And you've got the Palestinians who are, by the way, the majority today in Palestine. And these are the two nations that live there. So this strange assumption that if Palestinians had the same rights as I did, that would somehow harm me, is really a distorted view of the world. It's really distorted. And the way Israelis explain this, and the way Israelis are taught this, and the way Israelis view this, is that only one side can have rights. Because if the other side had rights, then they would kill us. And I remember actually hearing this growing up. If they had the ability, then they would kill us. Why would they kill us? But that's the paradigm. That's the reality in which they live. That's the perspective. So once again, these are all completely remedial demands. There's no request to kill, to deny, to do anything, to deprive. Will Israelis be inconvenienced when the refugees return? Perhaps. Well, if you take somebody's, there are entire Palestinian cities that have become artist colonies. In Safad, you see them in the north, and in Hod, and in Ankara, near Jerusalem. They've got these boutique hotels, and in Jerusalem too, in some of the neighborhoods, that were Palestinian neighborhoods. Some of these lovely homes were turned into boutique hotels or galleries, and it's so exotic. Well, if you take somebody's home and you've used it for 7 decades and they have the right to come back, yes, you're going to probably have to pay, rent. People have been dispossessed living in refugee camps. They deserve something, compensation, restitution. But it's the right thing to do. We can't live, when Dr. Azzam and I spoke at UCL in London, one Jewish girl said, well, you and your one-state solution, and where are the Jews supposed to go? I said, why do you think the Jews have to go? Why do you think the Jews have to go? Who said anything about the Jews going? If they want to go, fine, because a lot of Israelis say, we can't live with Palestinians. Well, then what are you doing in Palestine? Or as Hanin Zabi, who spoke the other day here, said, well, they want to live like Europe in Palestine. So why didn't they stay in Europe? Why did they come to Palestine? If you don't want to live with Arabs, what are you doing in an Arab country? So the assumption, once again, is that only one side can live with rights. Only one side can live well, and that's how it's got to be. That is our destiny. And this is a kind of a strange ideology that was formed quite early on by the Zionist geniuses who put together the state and kind of developed it. In fact, I think it was particularly in a speech that Moshe Dayan, who was Army Chief of Staff and then Secretary of Defense for many years, where he said, we look at these people in Gaza from whom we took the land and now want to kill us. But this is our destiny to live here, so we always have to live by the sword. Because if we allow them in, they will wipe us out, they will kill us. So when he looks, and Israelis look at the Gaza Strip, instead of seeing 2 million homeless refugees who have no access to water, electricity, proper nutrition, proper medical care, and that's before they're even bombed. That's before all the tens of thousands of injured and killed by the Israeli military. But even without that, they see danger. They want to come and kill us all. Well, obviously, if you treat people like this, they're not going to love you forever, right? But perhaps we can solve the problem by providing them what is available to Israelis. The problem is not that the Palestinians in Gaza want to kill Israelis. The problem is that Israelis are killing the people in Gaza. And forget the bombing for a moment. A child in Gaza with a curable disease will die. A woman with breast cancer in the Gaza Strip, if you compare the rate of survival to that of the rate of survival of Israeli women, it's shocking. It's beyond shocking. It's criminal. Because the healthcare facilities are a short drive from Gaza to excellent healthcare facilities that are provided to Israelis. But no, they can't have access. Only we can. Why? Is this not racism? Is this not apartheid? Of course it is. So these are the demands of the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Justice, freedom, equality. And how is that anti-Semitic? How is that anti-Semitic? You mean Jewish values are somehow contradict these? Or they contradict Jewish values? It's absurd. It's an absurd claim that somehow the call for BDS is anti-Semitic. Does it endanger Zionism? Absolutely. But Zionism is a racist ideology that should be endangered. And then, of course, people say, like they say, Dr. Azzam, yes, but you want to kill, and you want to destroy, and you want to kill. What is this notion of destroy and kill and destroy and kill? When people talk about ending apartheid, they talk about ending the system, destroying the system. Or like the Orthodox, actually, the Orthodox Jews, the Orthodox community, the ultra-Orthodox community, when they come to protest, they have these amazing banners. And they say, we pray for the peaceful dismantlement of the State of Israel. The peaceful dismantlement of the Zionist state. I think that's a great word. That's great wording. To say destroy, people get a little scared. Fine, don't destroy. We'll peacefully dismantle it. But we need to dismantle it, and we need to do it quickly. And boycott, divestment, and sanctions is precisely the roadmap. And it was given to us by the Palestinians, who are the people who are suffering from this. So they told us what they need, and now, if we are people of conscience, if we people who care, then we need to do this. It's not going to happen on its own. Palestine won't be free on its own. So that's this strange connection between, the claims or people who fight for real justice in Palestine and the claims that somehow it's anti-Semitic. It's not anti-Semitic. but it is anti-Zionist. And like Ilan Pappé said, again, when he spoke here a few days ago with Hanin Zobi, and I dared to say a couple of years ago as well, here, and got punished, you have to make a decision. You can't be Zionist and say you support justice. You can't say I'm a Zionist and I oppose racism. You can't be both, because Zionism is racism. Zionism is injustice. You know, I say this coming from probably the most Zionist background you could possibly imagine. You know, my father was a general in the IDF during 1967. I had a grandfather who signed the Declaration of Independence. I had an uncle, a great uncle, who was the president of the state. Can you imagine the doses of Zionism that I received growing up? I didn't have to learn about it in school, in a textbook, or in Sunday school at synagogue. This is stuff that, you know, every day at the dinner table, every weekend, every family gathering, I look around me, and all these people are my family. It wasn't speeches that I heard, it was people talking, you know, over hors d'oeuvres about our dinner, and this is how I know about Zionism. And I can't accept it. I, as a person who feels I have a conscience, cannot but reject Zionism. There is no way. If you have a conscience, that you do not reject Zionism. There is no way. People, we all have to make a choice. A lot of organizations, a lot of people say, well, I don't know. You can't. You either oppose racism or you support racism. There's no fence here that you can sit, that we can sit on. And Zionism is racism. So people of conscience have to reject Zionism. Perhaps they need a little education. So that's the BDS component. And then, you know, I'll end by saying what I like to say at the end of my talks. When we say free Palestine, what does that mean? If we don't know what it means, then what are we talking? Why are we even here? You know, why do we bother? You know, solidarity with Palestine, wearing the stickers and the T-shirts is great, the kufiya, but what are we talking about? Palestine is bleeding to death rapidly. Rapidly. 10 years ago, if somebody suggested that the U.S. would move its embassy to Jerusalem, you'd be laughed out of the room, because people would say, no, they would never do it. The world would turn upside down. The Muslim world would... They did it. Nothing happened. Now it's the reality. Today, if you say that the state of Israel is going to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque and build a temple, people still think you're a little crazy. But if you look into it, it's around the corner. The groups that used to promote this idea of destroying the Dome of the Rock and building a Jewish temple used to be Fringe. Today they're in the cabinet, they're in the government, and they're promoting this. They hold these tours, these provocations basically, going on to the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif. They used to be tens and a bunch of, you know, really fringe lunatics. Last year they had some 60, 70,000 people participate in these tours. This year they're expecting even more. They have architects already building it. Millions and millions of dollars invested in the planning. This is not a joke. Although there's a part of it that is ludicrous, because according to this strange sect, in order to be able to build a temple, you have to spread the ashes. I'm not kidding you. This is millions of dollars. This is people, not serious people, but this is actually being invested in. You have to spread the ashes of a red cow in order to purify the area. And there's a farm, there's an Israeli cattle breeder who's been paid millions of dollars for decades now, and he's breeding brown cows until he reaches just the perfect color. It's a big ranch on the Golan Heights, which, by the way, of course, we know now has Israeli sovereignty, but on the Syrian Golan Heights. I'm not kidding you. And then what's going to happen is, once this happens, people are going to say, oh, we didn't see it coming. We never thought this would happen. But the Zionists have done absolutely everything, step by step by step. Everything that was once thought to be absurd, that they would never do it, couldn't be possible, is now done. The settlers in the city of Hebron, in the old city of Hebron, these violent, racist gangsters. People used to say, nah, this would never, people like that could never, nah, they're a fringe. Look at them. They're running the show. In the city of Hebron. Look at the old city of Jerusalem. Same thing. So my point is, we have to define what it is that we're fighting for. What's a free Palestine? There's a great book that just came out. I don't know if you've seen it, by Nur Masalha. Palestine, a 4,000-year history. Grab it and read it. It helps define that. But Palestine has been, for a very long time, for thousands of years in fact, very well defined. A well-defined country. From the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea. From the Galilee in the north all the way down to the Nakab in the south. That's Palestine, all of it. When I talk about the country, I call it all Palestine. People are sometimes a little confused. I invite everybody to call it Palestine, because why would you call it something else? Just because on the 15th of May 1948 someone decided to stop calling it Palestine doesn't mean that we should legitimize that. So Palestine is well defined. And I think the word freedom is quite well defined. It means equality, it means freedom, it means justice, it means no checkpoints, no racist laws, no discrimination between people, a government and a parliament that represent all the people, free one person, one vote elections, the refugees' right to return, both from within Palestine, like in the Gaza Strip and other places, and from outside. That's what a free Palestine looks like. That's what a free Palestine is. And that's what we should be fighting for. And that's really what I believe BDS is laying the groundwork for. So, let's get off our backsides and do what we need to do to free Palestine. Thank you very much.
Miko touched briefly on the fact that he wasn't allowed into the Labour Party conference this year. Can you imagine if he was and he made a speech like that from the rostrum? The JLM and the Zionists would be apoplectic. They wouldn't know where to put themselves. But that's only half the story, because Miko attended last year's Labour conference in Liverpool. But he was actually ejected before Jeremy Corbyn's speech, which is one of the main reasons that he attended the conference. And he was ejected because in the Daily Mail, they saw him at the conference, took a picture of him, and splashed over the Daily Mail was a Holocaust denier attending the Labour Party conference. And nothing could be further from the truth because of what you've just heard. So we've got to be, if any members of the Labour Party here, we've got to be vigilant over what we're told and what we're told we can do and we can't do. Some of us have been suspended, some haven't. But the ones who do tend to bring these injustices to the notice of not just people in the Labour Party, but the public in general, tend to get vilified. So we need to encourage anybody who tends to put themselves out on a limb and point to the Labour Party that they don't have to, or they shouldn't, just speak to support of Palestinians. They should do something about it and let people like Miko and Azzam and Tom, who know the background to all of these stories, speak to the people and not try and shut them up as they've tried to do. So we'll have a short toilet break, and then afterwards we'll have a question and answer, and you can put your questions to Miko, Azzam, Tom. Sure.
2 years ago, when we just spoke at the meeting house, there was a moral, and it was suddenly the next day in the Daily Mail.
Sorry, Alan. Spoke up where?
Here in Brighton.
All right. Okay. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
Dreadfully was, because he started saying Miko should be thrown out of the Labour Party. He didn't even realise that Miko was an Israeli, not a Brit. And
Yeah.
I mean, this is the English people who don't understand anything.
Tom Watson also wanted myself and Chris thrown out of the Labour Party as well for organising.
You are British, you are members.
Yeah.
Hunt us down
Yeah, that was his words. He'd hunt us down and throw us out.
and expel us from the Labour Party.
But you are British, you are members. He knew so little about Miko and his greatness and how he fits into all of this. I mean, it's bonkers.
Yeah, of course.
There are people who know nothing.
And it's no surprise that Tom Watson's a Zionist. Right, if we could just adjourn for a few minutes. Thanks. You have to stay for a bit, Tom?
You're going to get rid of this. I can throw my stuff in the back.
All right, okay.
There's a day latest.